There we go. I'm going to start over. Welcome to the home composting webinar with the Thurston County Master Recycler Composter Program. We're going to be talking about home composting today in honor of International Compost Awareness Week. My name is Jenny Post. I'm the program assistant for the Master Recycler Composter Program of Thurston County. Before I pass it over to Corey, I just want to go over a few housekeeping topics. For this presentation, your microphone and camera are disabled, as well as the Zoom chat function. We encourage you to participate, though, by asking questions using the Q&A function, which is located at the bottom of your screen. You can put questions in the Q&A throughout the presentation, and during a few designated points, we will address those questions. If you're having trouble with the view option, like if part of the screen at the bottom is cut off, hover your cursor over the upper right-hand corner of your screen where you will see a view option. Just click on that and play around with that to get the right view for you. So this presentation is being recorded, and we'll have a link to the recording in the follow-up materials. So just to kind of test the Q&A function, let's, if you wouldn't mind typing in if you compost at home or if you have curbside collection of food and yard waste. You can do that while I'm introducing our presenter. So our presenter tonight is Corey Carlton, Program Coordinator with WSU Thurston County Extension. Corey coordinates the WSU Master Gardener and Master Recycler Composter programs. So Corey, I think you're up. Let's see here. Yeah, so it looks like some folks are composting at home and using the curbside collection.
Great. Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for participating in tonight's webinar. As Jenny said, we'll be providing follow-up information, but for right now, I'm going to focus this presentation on home composting basics. So I am going to share my screen here. And again, if you have questions, just be sure to type them in the Q&A, and then we'll stop and answer those throughout a couple different points in the presentation. So again, this is a basics. Composting is a very large subject. There's lots and lots of components to it, but today we're going to focus on what you can actually do on your at home. So I won't be discussing a lot about curbside collection or also self-haul, but mostly focusing on what you can actually do in your backyard, front yard, side yard, etc. So the one thing I think most folks sometimes get intimidated with is the fact is that there's all these specific things that you need to worry about, maybe a specific recipe of sorts that you actually have to follow for compost to happen. And in fact, you don't. You just basically need to have the materials, and nature's process will actually help and with that. And so it's helpful just to know that you don't have to be a composting superhero to actually compost. We can start at all different points and figure out what composting method works best for you. So I do want to emphasize just again the three different options here for managing plant and food scraps here in Thurston County. We do have curbside pickup available. That's again where you'd contact your local hauler, and they would put out your yard debris, and basically that could also include food scraps, could also go into your curbside collection. That gets collected, and then it is taken to a facility here, also here in Thurston County, called Silver Springs Organics, and that's where it's commercially processed. And so we will be having another webinar about that process, but for tonight, as I said, we're going to talk about our composting at home instead. One other way of actually managing yard waste and yard debris and food scraps is to actually self-haul it over to the Thurston County Waste and Recovery Center, which is located at the what's also known as the WARC over in Hawks Prairie. And that's where you can, again, pay with a fee, take a carload or a truckload of yard debris. It's then mulched and ground up there, which eventually then will go down to Silver Springs in Rainier, and then it will be finished composting it at that facility. But for tonight's presentation, again, we're going to talk about composting here at home. And so whether you have, you're in an apartment or whether or not you have acreage and everything in between, composting can happen. And so we'll be diving into that. So my first question is, what is compost? And in these webinars and on Zoom, it's a little weird because normally when I give this presentation in person, this is the time where normally the audience would respond back. And so for some of these, it is a little bit of, I guess you could just, on your end, say it out loud, and then hopefully the answers will be the same. So basically, this is a kind of a Webster's dictionary definition that compost is simply the combination of yard debris, like grass clippings and fallen leaves, and or kitchen scraps, such as fruit or vegetable spoils, that are separated from the waste stream and placed in an environment suitable for decomposition. And the end result is used in fertilizing the soil. So that's what we're kind of talking about tonight. Is we're going to focus on what you can actually use by using the yard debris and the food scraps in order to make something that actually will enhance your soil without having to buy it. So are there benefits? So hopefully you are saying yes, because there are plenty of reasons why we should compost and not have this material be taken to the landfill instead. So number one, it creates a nutrient-rich soil amendment. So if you are a gardener or have space where you like to have different kinds of plants or trees, this is another easy way in order to provide nutrients for those. It also helps conserve water, filters pollution and stormwater. It also controls weeds and reduces and eliminates the need for conventional fertilizers and pesticides. So, and I think another important part is that a lot of times if you have yard debris and you have it curbside, it gets hauled away, and then you're buying it, there's a way that you could actually do some cost saving by actually composting it on site and not having to actually go out and buy it. So that's another way that it helps reduce cost as well. And then ultimately that compost there improves soil structure by helping with erosion control and also aeration. Overall, it's better for the planet rather than having these materials just go into the landfill, which that's one of the major components of landfills now, is actually yard waste and food and vegetable scraps. So if we can actually take that out, our landfills will have less pressure on them. And then ultimately, you're also saving yourself money by not paying for that disposal to happen. The other important part that I think I've really noticed over the last maybe 3 or 4 years is that there has been a huge desire to actually know what is in your compost. So meaning you know what actually materials were put into your compost, and so you know the end result will not have contamination in it. And so that is one of the things where recently we've had more and more press about contaminated compost being purchased and also having adverse effect on those plants. So we'll touch on that a little bit later. But ultimately, I think the reason why to compost is it's fun. It gets you out there connecting with your materials that you have actually in your yard, spend time outside, lots of oxygen, and right now we all know that that's an important part of our mental health as well. I did want to share with you the food recovery hierarchy. This is provided by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and they're talking about food recovery. And this is, again, one of the major components of landfills right now are yard and food waste. And so ultimately, this goes on this axis here is most preferred to least preferred. And if you're looking at food recovery, we want to source reduction first. So we want to make sure that we are not producing too much food where then it can't be used. But if so, then here is the hierarchy of doing that, is feeding hungry people first with it, feeding animals, any industrial uses of it. And then this is where composting comes in. So whether it's either on a small scale or a large commercial scale, this is where we would then be processing where all of the excess that was, was produced, and we tried all these different ways here in order to use it, but now we're finally at the composting stage, and that's the last stage before it goes to the landfill or to be incinerated. So obviously composting does play a huge part because the last step is, again, landfill or incineration. Here's also another way is that when you're talking about compost there is like you're putting your organic waste in there, again, your fruit and vegetable scraps there, during a process that has lots of air called an aerobic breakdown, compared to an anaerobic breakdown where there is no oxygen, and that's what actually happens in the landfill. So things are bagged up in plastic bags, oxygen can't get in, and as a result, methane gas is produced. Instead, where if we actually use the compost here on our plants, those plants could actually help capture carbon instead, which is more beneficial. For those that aren't aware, that where our organic waste, which is again our yard debris, and that goes and stays here within Thurston County, but for those items that actually get thrown into the trash, our trash actually does quite a long trip. It starts in Thurston County, where it goes to the Waste and Recovery Center in Hawks Prairie. Then it gets trucked down to Centralia, where it then is loaded onto a train. From the train, it goes all the way down to the Columbia River and starts heading east to eastern Washington, where eventually there's a transfer station from the train back to a truck, where ultimately goes here to the Roosevelt landfill. And that's what you're seeing here. And that's where all of our trash goes. So overall, it's about just over 200 miles to get to our trash to where it eventually resides. And so any way that we could help minimize that trip and actually use the stuff on site would be beneficial for everyone. So before we actually begin, we want to kind of focus in on three things. So whether you're starting composting new or whether or not you've been composting for years, these are the three things that you constantly have to be evaluating so that you pick the best way that's best composting method that will work best for you. So the number one question is, how much space do you have? So, and that changes over lifetime. So do you live in a single family residence? Do you live in a high rise or a multi-family situation? Or do you have acreage? And so with all of these different options, there's different composting methods that are suited for that particular environment. And so if I was to say, yeah, we'd like to have a compost pile on a 3-bin system, if I live on the 5th floor of this apartment complex, that's probably not your best choice. But you could do worm composting. That's an easy one that can easily be done inside or outside. So always evaluating how much space you have is critical to the success of your compost pile. The other one is you need to be paying attention to how much waste you do have. And again, do you live in a single resident family? Do you have 2 people? Do you have 4 people? How many people do you have in your family? And so that also helps determine how much materials you'll have in order to actually what's needed for composting. And then you have to look at exactly what do you have that you would like to compost. So again, if you have a curbside collection, you have options where you can just put those items into the cart. So again, any types of gardening materials, leaves, as well as your food scraps can also go into your curbside organics bin. If you're composting on your own property, there are certain things that you're not going to put in your home pile that you can at a curbside situation. For example, meats and oils, so let's say salad that's covered in salad dressing. You wouldn't want to put a lot of that in a home system where you could easily put that into curbside collection bin. So here are some items that you could compost at home. So you've got fruit and vegetable matter, yard debris, lawn clippings. One thing to be aware of, that if you do use a weed and feed on your lawn, you need to make sure that your lawn clippings are composted for at least a year before putting them onto your fruits and vegetables plants. So the hotter the compost pile gets, the more the residue that is left from that pesticide will be decreased or diminished. But if you do treat it, again, with a weed and feed, that residue left from that pesticide, from the weed part of that particular product, does stay with the grass clippings longer. And so just you want to be aware of that. Certain paper products, again, things that aren't heavily wax coated are better for home systems. If you have sawdust, some of that's good, just not in large volumes. Wood chips also are great. They're better if they're on the smaller side. They used as a bulking agent. Eggshells, some are good. Again, volume is critical with this. So some are okay. You just don't want to have massive amounts. And I'll get into that in a second. Coffee grounds and filters, tea bags, and some manures. Some manures are great. Others you want to avoid using in your composting pile. So what can't I compost at home? So these are a few things that you shouldn't do. And again, this is in a home system. So you don't want to put obviously any kind of hazardous waste or trash. And this is again in a backyard or even a front yard, side yard system. You don't want to have meats, oils, dairy, food in those home piles because it will attract rodents for sure. It takes a lot longer. The bacteria needed to actually break through those oily barriers, it's a lot harder for them to work at getting through to that, let's say, lettuce leaf that's covered in ranch dressing. The bacteria are going to find an easier source of food. And what happens is then it ends up going rancid before and then causes a whole bunch of other problems. So where meats, oils, and dairy foods are good for the curbside collection, they're not as good for the home system. Spoiled food with potential pathogens, again, anything that's meat related that is no longer edible should not be necessarily going in your home pile. Home systems don't get enough heat. They don't get hot enough in order to break down that material, where commercial composting systems like at Silver Springs, they do. They do end up getting the high enough temperatures to actually break down those foods, so it's easier for them to be processed. Certain weeds, again, you want to avoid certain weeds altogether. So some weeds that are very invasive are definitely weeds that have already gone to seed. You want to avoid those in your compost. So try to actually deadhead your plants before they have gone to seed, especially with those persistent weeds that could cause some other problems later down without being fully composted. Diseased and thorny plants, again, commercial facilities can handle that, those, let's say, rose canes from a rose bush. Too many of them in your home system, they just take a lot longer to actually process, sometimes years. And then also there's a safety concern too with you pricking yourself. So you want to make sure that you either break those things up small, or in that case, actually you turn them into a commercial facility where they can process those at those hotter temperatures. Limited citrus and cedar. And so with limited citrus and cedar, both of those are naturally antibacterial killer. So if you think about your natural cleaning products, a lot of them are citrus or cedar scent. And because they have those, again, those properties that are naturally causing for bacteria to no longer exist. So if I'm trying to actually, as a composting, creating a composting pile, you actually want to become a bacteria farmer and increase the bacteria in your compost pile so that it actually can compost properly. So by putting in a whole bunch of citrus and cedar, you're actually killing off the bacteria that are there to actually do the work. So again, a couple orange peels or a couple pieces of cedar sticks from your tree are not going to cause a problem. But I have seen this at schools or at daycare centers where they've had for snack, you know, a couple hundred kids all eating oranges. And I have seen piles, compost piles stall where they stop producing, they stop heating up because there was too much actually citrus, and the citrus actually killed off the bacteria. So they had to be removed, and then we had to work on getting new bacteria in there so that we could actually start to balance it and have a better ratio. Don't want to put treated or painted wood in there. Again, that's really hard for those things to be breaking down, and also there could be toxins in the paint that could leach out into the compost. Plastics or bioplastics. These are items that are listed compostable. Sometimes you see a lot of products now that have the labeling on it. They're made from corn or soy, different types of, they're called bioware or bioplastics. Those do not break down in a home system. The temperatures do not get hot enough. And there are only a limited amount of commercial facilities that also take them because it typically, the breakdown process is at least 180 days for a lot of those things to be broken down or longer. And most composting commercial facilities would like to have their product come into the facility and actually processed and actually be out of the facility within 30 to 45 days. So there is right now not a lot of commercial facilities actually taking the bioplastics because they can't do the turnaround of having a clean product as they leave the facility. So we've done plenty as master recycler composters. We've done plenty of trials in our own yards to see if some of these bioplastics would break down in our own backyards, and hence they have not. They've been there for years, and they look exactly, the spoon looks exactly the way it did maybe 4 or 5 years that we've had it into the pile. So again, those things just don't heat up. Our backyard piles are not designed to heat to the temperatures which is needed in order to break those down. Some barbecue ash is fine, again, just not large volumes of it. Also, it's better if it's from like a campfire, where charcoal ash from like a barbecue could also have some other additives. So you need to read your labeling of what type of charcoal you're using to see if they have other types of chemicals added to the charcoal briquettes. Because that could also cause some problems if you're going to use that ash in your compost pile to stall some of the bacteria. Liquids, again, some are good. Water's the best. Some people ask, well, can I put orange juice? Can I put, soda in it? You just have to think about if the bacteria, what they need in order to survive. And if you have too many things that are very acidic, it actually will kill off those bacteria. So keeping liquids to just kind of water products is best. You want to have some dirt and soil in your pile, but too much of it can actually stall your pile as well. So whenever you're building a new pile, you want to have your materials put into the pile. Then I always take a pile of soil or from one of my other beds and add it to the new pile. So that way I'm starting that pile with a fresh new batch of bacteria. And so that's helpful whenever you're starting a new pile. And then some pet manures that are good are chicken, rabbit, sheep, alpaca. Those are all great manures that can be used in the composting process. Horse and cow are kind of the next tier. The only problem with their typical manures is that there's a lot of bedding that also goes with it, and you have to know what's in that bedding to make sure that you're not having a lot of extra seeds that can't get processed, and then all of a sudden you're spreading those weed seeds as you have that finished compost back out into your garden beds. So that's the one thing to be more aware of, that horse and cow are good to be composted, but you just have to be more aware of the bedding that comes with that manure coming in. A couple of manures that you don't ever want to compost or use in your home systems are dog and cat, as well as pig. All three of those have different sets of bacteria that are pretty persistent, and they don't actually burn out in the composting process. And so those are to be better left for commercial facilities that can manage that and are more aware of it, or for our case, putting them bagged and put it into the trash. So those are a couple of things you don't want to compost at home. Okay, so if you look at all that, how much space do you have? How much materials you have, and you realize, you know what, I don't really have the ability to compost, then here's one option that we're going to give you. So you can buy compost. Let's say the other thing about it is composting at home does take some physical work too. And if you're not able to do that, here's another option for you. So we do suggest that you review this compost. And I'm going to give you, again, we'll be sending you a email that has a follow-up list of all these resources. This will say, if you're interested in buying compost, we encourage you to read this document here. And it asks questions to ask your supplier in which you're buying the compost from. It also shows you a chart with how much to buy so that you can decide like how many bags do you actually truly need, and then also how to properly use it. So if you realize, you know what, all the stuff that I've just gone over, I don't have enough supply, I don't have, I'm not interested in the physicality of composting, then here's an option for you to buy it and still have your plants benefit from the use of compost. One thing that I'm not going to touch on tonight, but I do want folks to be aware of, that if you're buying compost there, that's why it is really critical to ask your suppliers about their composting process and also where they're sourcing their materials from. is because in recent years, we've had more and more problems with companies actually inadvertently having contaminated compost. And so, and it's also come in soil mixes as well. In fact, last year, Portland had a major vendor have a herbicide contaminated compost that went out and many people bought it, and all of their plants had stunted growth because of it. And so it became such a big problem that actually Oregon State University created a publication about it. If you hear this, the tag word that you kind of see out in the on the social media sites and that is called killer compost. If you were to just put that into Google, you'll end up getting a lot of these the information about that. But it's basically contaminated compost or soil mix is where the herbicide residue is still persistent in the compost and it affects plant growth. And so a lot of the times it curls the leaves. And so if you're interested in learning more about that, again, Oregon State just put together this publication to help educate folks about that, just because it was such a huge problem in Portland last year. Okay, so we're now at a question period. So if you have any questions about any of the material I just covered, please type your question into the Q&A box, and Jenny will be sharing that.
We don't have any questions waiting for us.
Okay. Okay, great. Then if not, then we'll keep going. We'll have another question period here coming up. So if you think of anything else, just put it into the Q&A box. Okay, so let's get into the composting process. So if you look at the composting process, it's actually what I kind of view as just kind of, if it was a car, this is how it would operate. So there are kind of three main parts to the composting process. Us, as the humans, we're the operator of the car. We also need the engine, which is our microorganisms. And then we also have where we need fuel in order to fuel the car, which would, in this case, would be the organic waste. So those are your food scraps, all of your leaves, your bark, things that, tree clippings, dead plants or spent flowers, all of that is all considered the fuel or organic waste. So these three parts are needed in order for the composting process to effectively happen. If you remove humans, these two will still operate. The organic waste and the microherd will still allow compost to happen. It's just a slower process. By injecting a human into it, we actually speed the process, the composting process up. So that's one way of doing it. So again, here are some options. The microherd or the engine are kind of the bacteria, the fungus, the worms, and the bugs. And so we are not going to be covering that in today's presentation, but we will have another future presentation if you're curious about all the little microorganisms that are actually are part of the composting process. And here's just an example of some of them. As your compost ages and goes through the composting process, you will see at different stages of your compost pile different types of critters. Some of them will be there in the very beginning, and they will leave, and other ones will come in as the decomposition process happens within your pile. So sometimes you're like, hey, I see all these little white springing things. They might be springtails, and you see those tend to be in the first, when you're first creating a pile. But all of a sudden then you might see at the very end of your pile, you might end up seeing some beetles, or you see centipedes or mites. Again, those typically are not there in the very beginning when the pile's created, but more towards the end. So you will see different critters come into your pile as the composting process happens. And tonight's presentation, we're not going to go into detail, but we'll have another webinar in order to see what some of these are and also when I should be looking out for them. So basically, if you've got the bacteria and the fungus eating this organic material, these are the two components that are needed for a compost pile to actually exist and also help benefit the bacteria and the fungus. So you need carbons and you need nitrogens. So for carbon, those are the carbohydrates for these bacteria and fungus. And they are considered what are called browns. Now, it has nothing to do with color. It just has to do, they're considered bulking agents, and so their nickname is called browns. For nitrogen, these are typically the proteins that are needed in order to build the strong bodies for the bacteria and fungus. And they're considered greens. And again, they don't have to be green in color. It's just that's their nickname, is considered greens, and they're more the energy agents of the compost pile. So if you look at these two piles here, they've got browns and you've got greens. And so we'll be going into a detail in a little bit about what actually those products are. For us, we're going to actually look at a couple different systems of composting. So we have the passive cold composting system. We have an active hot composting system. We have vermicomposting, which is worm composting. We will have another webinar on that specific topic coming up, so that's another one if you're interested in learning about that. And then bokashi is another type of composting. The composting systems we're talking about tonight are what are considered aerobic, meaning oxygen is needed for the process to happen. Bokashi is actually a system that is anaerobic, where you're trying to remove all oxygen from the decomposition process. That process also is really geared towards food waste and not a lot of yard waste. And so if you're interested in learning about that, that's another, you can take a look at and learn some of our resources for bokashi. So again, a different method, removing the oxygen from the process. And it's just more geared towards food waste production, where these other ones that are aerobic can be food waste as well as yard debris. So if you look at the two methods here, we basically have two systems. The passive cold system, as I said before in the car example, is that the microherd and the fuel, as long as those two things are present, compost is going to happen naturally. So in this case, if we were to just put a bunch of this pile in our yard and just put a bunch of grass and maybe some other types of weed debris there and left it alone, in about 2 years, the bottom of this pile would be finished compost. It'd be compost that is available, that we could add to our plants as a good source of fertilizer for those plants. We're not turning it, we're just basically leaving it alone and letting nature take its course. In about 2 years, this pile would be considered finished compost. So that's why it's called cold. That's why it's called passive, because we're not actively engaging with it, and we're not mixing it, which increases the temperature of the pile. So you basically just leave it, and that's what it is. So yeah, that's considered the passive system. Now the other method, which is called the hot system or active system, and that means the theory behind this is U plus turning of the pile plus moisture will increase the rate of decomposition. So if you're looking at this particular situation, they are actually collecting materials. They're actually turning it, adding water, making sure that they have a right balance of that. And by doing so, the act of you turning that pile and making sure that the right moisture content is in there will actually increase the bacteria so that they're producing more energy, which raises the temperature of the pile. And by doing so, that actually increases the rate of that decomposition. So in typically a hot active system, within 4 to 6 months from start to finish, you can actually have finished compost rather than 2 years. So that's the difference between passive and an active. Traditionally, when you do a hot or active system, you use a bin. So it could be all different types of bins, and so, but here's some options for bins, and we'll get into that here in a second here. So hot versus cold, again, typically in a bin versus cold, which is not, or sometimes these bins, if you leave them alone, you add them in there, but you don't actually go back to them in 2 years, it could act as a cold system as well. So again, what the difference between a hot and cold is you and the amount of energy you're putting in, whether you're going to turn that pile to keep it active. Okay, so with slow or cold composting, again, it takes up to 2 years. Traditionally, when you have those big piles, it's not great to put food waste in there because it does expose, it's pretty exposed to the environment. So if you have problems with raccoons or possums and that, this is like an open invitation to them if you put food scraps in there for them to visit. So it's not restricted by pile size, and there's typically a lot of good diversity because normally the pile is close to the soil, so the bacteria and the fungus can actually move freely from the soil into the compost pile and back. And so you tend to have a lot more diversity happening there. And really it doesn't require any labor because you're just leaving it there. And the only downside for this is particularly is that if you have put a lot of weeds in there with seeds in them, is that the pile never gets hot enough to actually destroy the weed seeds. So in the end, it may look like finished compost, but some of those seeds still may be viable in there. So then you take that compost and then you go out and put it into the rest of your beds. And then all of a sudden you have weeds now showing up in that space. That's the only downside with cold composting, is that typically those piles just don't get hot enough to kill the weed seeds. Okay, with hot or fast composting, again, as I said, 4 to 6 months, it does take some labor in order for it to be effective. And in this case, a typical size of a standard composting bin is actually proven to be 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. So if you purchase a bin, most bins are already in that format. So they already are designed for 3 feet to 3 feet by 3 feet as the most effective way to use compost. Yeah, the process of it. So typically with when you're building a new pile, you will see a spike in temperature, and typically you're over the next few weeks after you finish building a pile, the temperatures will get up to about 140 to 160 degrees. If you get over 140 degrees, that's when you can have the potential to kill off those weed seeds. So anything less than 140, it really doesn't have an effect on those seeds, and they could still exist even within the finished compost. The only problem with super hot compost is that sometimes it can kill the beneficial good organisms because it's a too hot of an environment for them. And the other thing is, I have heard, and we've seen here even in Olympia, of composting piles catching on fire. And that is the case if the compost pile is newly built and it gets up to super hot temperatures and it's right next to something that's flammable, like a wooden structure. We have had examples of composting piles actually starting on fire. So that's something to be aware of when you're figuring out where to put it. So the best part about hot compost is good for both yard waste and food waste. So a container, do you need one? So the answer is you can use it, but again, for cold systems, it's not necessary. Typically for hot systems, it helps with make sure that you're maintaining those temperatures and helping make sure that the pile sizes are in that 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet size. So here are some of the more commercially produced ones that are made out of plastic. You can also do wire mesh, like chicken wire or hardware cloth. Also, you can have here all kinds of wood pallets. And then again, the cold system is just, it's not necessary, but you have an option of using that as another possibility too. Okay, so this next section, we do have a handout on our website. And again, the information will be posted in our follow-up email about where you can compare the different types of bin styles. So if you're wondering like, oh, is it better for me to do a plastic bin, or maybe it's better for me to do a wire bin, or maybe a pallet. So we actually created a flyer that says the different bin style and the pros and cons of that bin style, which will then help you make a better decision about which bin would be helpful for you in your site. These next slides I'm going to go through right now, they have a whole bunch of the pros and cons on each slide. I'm not going to review all of the pros and cons for each style. I just want you to see what each of the bin styles are, so that way you can go to this handout and make a more informed decision. So one that you don't need is, again, digging a hole and burying it. That is one option. Obviously, it's low cost there. Traditionally, the only problem with this is that you need to mark it very clearly where you have dug. And also you want to monitor your food scraps in there, because that could also cause rodents to visit your property more, especially if it's accessible to them. Typically, the biggest problem with this is that people forget where the hole is. And especially if you have multiple holes around your yard, that can get confusing about which one you actually should be burying it in. So, but this is a process that existed for thousands of years. So yes, it does work. But again, depending on your situation, you may want to have your backyard filled with all these different kind of composting holes. Mulching. Mulching is another great way of using that finished compost there. Right now May is a perfect time to add mulch to a lot of your beds. I do have a slide here coming up that has a couple pros and cons for those as well. But just keep in mind that overall mulch here is great for your plants, and that's a benefit of actually using it, is making sure that you're saving water as well. Grass cycling, that's another name for a mulching lawnmower. So basically, instead of actually having a bag where then you would have to bag that material up, this just basically cuts the grass blades into fine particles and distributes them back onto the lawn. And that eventually will break down and actually keeping the nutrients in a continuous cycle. So again, there's pros and cons to this type of composting. The one biggest problem that with mulching lawnmowers is that you do have to keep up with your grass, meaning if it gets too long, it's very hard for the mulching lawnmower to process. So you do end up having to mow more frequently in order to keep the right height of your lawn so that it doesn't clog up, or you don't have these massive clumps of broken up leaf blades all over your lawn, which could also cause other adverse effects. A heap. So as we saw in a couple of those other slides, is basically just putting into a piles. If you have property, you can put it in your, on a part that's not very viewable, and just letting it go. And so that's an easy way. There's no cost to it, but in that case, it does take time. It's a slower rate of decomposition. The pallet system. A lot of times pallets are readily found, or people are looking to get rid of them, and so you can find them on a lot of reusable sites. And you can wire them together. They can be, a con would be is that they sometimes can get a little unwieldy, meaning that when you're trying to go in there and turn the compost pile, is that sometimes the actual bin just falls apart. But they can be painted and they can be made beautiful, or keep them natural, but they are easily an easy way to actually create a bin. The wire mesh system also works as well. The only con with this is that it dries out more quickly. We tend to use wire mesh systems in our demonstration gardens that we have here in part of the program as a way to collect our bulking materials. So our browns, when we're ready to stockpile them, we use wire mesh in order to hold those materials until we're ready to add them to the pile. So that is one benefit, I would say, is that these wire bins are helping us stockpile our supplies. And they're relatively inexpensive, so that's another pro as well. The other thing about this to be cautious of, if you've had one of these all winter long, in the springtime, be cautious of the critters that have probably moved into those bins over the winter time. A lot of times snakes, mice find winter homes in there because it's a nice warm spot. And more recently, we've seen multiple times where bird nests have been made inside those piles. And so just be aware of that as well. A plastic bin. There are literally hundreds of different styles now. When we first started the program, we used to sell bins because they weren't readily available to clients, but now they can be found at any of the big box stores, any of your local hardware stores, as well as can be shipped directly to your house. And there's all different types of styles. Traditionally, this style of one where it has a lid and a door, typically where you could extract the compost, the finished compost once it's finished here. Sometimes they come with a lid, which is like a plastic piece on the bottom. We encourage you not to use the lid on the bottom. If you're concerned about rodents or other things coming up from below your pile, we suggest you put hardware cloth or chicken wire on the bottom of it, which will allow the bacteria to freely move in and out of the pile, but it won't allow the rodents to go back up it. When you have a solid surface, like a plastic sheet that comes with this bin particularly, what happens is you're blocking that bacteria from being able to freely move from your soil into the pile and back. And so your composting process takes longer. A two-bin system, so basically can be made out of wood or concrete blocks here, and these are typically done for larger volumes. So if you have a lot of animals, let's say, like if you have horses or cows and that, we've seen these large industrial styles where you have two bins and you're basically taking one, you're filling up here, and then when it's time to rotate, you then rotate it into this pile, and then you keep them going back and forth, just rotating them back and forth. Traditionally, their downside with this is that there's more cost up front, but then after that, they're very sturdy and reliable. So they are long lasting, which is definitely a pro. A 3-bin system. I always tell our Master Gardener volunteers that if I ever win the lottery, this is one of the systems that I would love to purchase for everybody in the world, is to actually have a 3-bin system. It allows you to have 2 piles going at the same time, but it also provides you a bin here, a 3rd bin, for the compost to actually rest or cure, which is one of the steps that a lot of folks tend to miss, and that is really a critical step to the success of finished compost. You need a space for that pile to rest completely before it can be used. And so a 3-bin system allows you to have 2 piles being active back and forth, but then still having one space for that that composting process to finish out. Okay, here's the barrel system or the turning system. And traditionally, these are the ones that are the most popular on the market right now. That is one of the things that just because they're produced doesn't necessarily mean that they are the best. And so overall, as the Master Recycler Composter program, this is not the bin that we recommend as being your first bin or a bin that's traditionally used. Folks that have them, sometimes they've found the right recipe in order to make it work. But in this case, we end up getting more and more complaints about them not working properly and wondering why. There's a couple different reasons. One, it's a small system, space that is not connected to the soil. So there's no possible way that you can get bacteria freely moving from your soil into the pile. And so what happens is you're constantly having to monitor that to make sure that there's enough bacteria in there to keep your pile actually active. And it takes more maintenance in order for that to happen. The other problem with this is that, especially if there are bins that are rolling that are higher, is that you actually have to lift your shovel to have that material be put in, and then people tend to overfill them, which makes it very difficult to turn. And as a result, there's actually been proven documentation of more back injuries and other body injuries from composting after these bins were actually put on the market than prior. So it's not to say that they can't be successful, they just there are more high maintenance in order for the composting process to actively work in there. So this is one typically that we say, oh, which bin should I get? Typically the barrel system is not the one that we go to first. We encourage other types of bins first, just because it's less maintenance. A worm bin is another great option for folks. If you live in a townhouse or an apartment, and you have a small balcony, you can even do worm bin composting on your balcony. And it goes everything up to a large scale farm as well. We will have a separate workshop on worm bins from tonight's presentation, and so just be watchful of that. And if you're interested in that, then make sure you join us for that, and so we can show you all the ins and outs of creating a worm bin. Lasagna composting. This is another way where you're actually doing a layering system of your greens and your browns mixed in with some soil, and actually then you plant in it. So this is another composting process. It used to be called layered composting, but they decided to jazz up the name a little bit, and now it's called lasagna composting. And because of that, more books have been sold. So yeah, one of those things to keep in mind, that this is another process of just basically taking your space, digging more like a trench, and actually layering your materials in what would be considered layers. All right, we're now at another question period. Is there anything, if you have a question, type them into the Q&A box, or I can answer any that are there.
We have 2 questions.
Okay.
So how far down should I dig in when I'm turning the compost in a 3x3 bin?
You actually want to fully make sure that everything gets mixed. So if you have the hardest part about a bin is getting the corners. So if you have corners, is typically it's easier to get all the middle stuff actively composted, but actually you want to make sure that really everything is turned. So making sure if you use the proper tools, which we're going to get to a second here, show you some tools that will help with that. You want to make sure that when you're actively turning it, you get all the parts mixed, and also that will help keep those the air ratios right, as well as you also want to water while you're turning as well. So when you turn, you also water. That's at the same time.
Okay. We have a 3-bin system, but we are unsure when to feed, stir, or stop feeding each bin. It's planting time, but our compost bins aren't ready.
Yep. That's the problem traditionally with the bin system, is that each space has a finite amount of space. And sometimes your ratios are off, meaning we have an excess of browns at one time of the year, or we have an excess of greens at one time of the year, but then other times of the year we don't. And so even with the 3-bin system, it comes a point in time where you actually have to stop adding anything to it because it'll never completely finish. And so you'll see a slide coming up that says that's the birthday of that particular pile. So it's the date there. So what I would say is that I would focus in on maybe stockpiling finding another space around the compost pile to stockpile some of those greens and browns, and then work on getting the piles that are in there to a finished state so that you can get it into the curing phase before you actually start a new pile.
Do we have time for one more question?
Sure.
At this point, how do I restart a hot pile that has gone cold?
Okay, so the best way to do that is you want to add more greens. And so actually let's get to that slide there and to make sure that we know what greens are, and then I'll make sure I answer that in that particular slide. Does that work?
Sounds good.
Okay, so was there anything else?
There was one more question about how do we know when compost is ready, but I think you're going to be getting
Yep, we're getting to that. Right now we're at that stage. Yes, you guys are so good on top of it. Yay. So, all right, so this is it. What does this all mean? Which system's right for me? What do I do? So here, this is now where we're at. We're trying to figure out what's best. So you have to keep in mind that every batch of compost you make is just like a recipe. And that with different materials, you're going to end up having different results. It's kind of, it's science, but it's also part art. And so here are these composting cakes here that we put together as a symbol, a symbol of that analogy, is that the different materials you put into your pile some of them will go quicker, and then other times of the year it might take longer, and that's just based on what the ratios of whatever you put in to that pile. It determines how long it will take. So you have to kind of go in with that mindset, thinking that each pile, even though you had a pile that worked really fast this last time, maybe you have different materials this time. It may take longer or it might be quicker. But each pile is its own entity and its own recipe. And I would say that just like in real recipes, it very rarely looks exactly like the picture that you see on the recipe card. There's always something different for each of them there. So before we actually begin with our managing your pile, these are the things you should be aware of. One, wearing gloves. There are pathogens that can happen, especially if you are using meat products as well. That can have pathogens, or manures if you're using manures. I wouldn't say meat because traditionally you don't put meat in a home system, but yes, in manures, yes, you want to make sure that you wear gloves as a protectant there. Other items that if you have a lawn, obviously you have a lawnmower, some kind of mulching mower there. Pruners of any type of hand clippers or pruners there are helpful in order to make sure that the material that you put in is a manageable size. And we'll get to that in a second. Also saw, that also helps break up those larger things. Pitchfork or a manure fork is our go-to tool in using compost. The other part about this is in the fall, especially when we're doing cleanup, is we love tarps. So we'll put a tarp out, and then we'll go around, clean up our beds, put everything onto the tarp, and then haul the tarp over to our holding area where we stockpile our browns. And so a tarp is really a great best friend to when you're composting. Water is critical, and that I would say is the number one thing that typically here in the Northwest, when piles stall, it's because they didn't get enough water. or the ratios were off. But more importantly, I would say water. Lack of water is the number one reason here in the Northwest I've seen numerous times. They're like, we live in the Northwest, there's plenty of water. It has to be the right consistency. So, and then temperature, a thermometer is another easy tool that you can buy. It's a composting thermometer, and unfortunately I don't have one here with me. But it's an extra long thermometer. You can Google composting thermometer on Google and you can see it. That also helps us track the temperature. So if you're curious, getting one of those composting thermometers is a great tool because you can actually see the different temperatures of your pile and the stages in which it goes through. So if you have a current pile, my question to you is like, well, I already know where I'm going to have it, but maybe the idea, what I'm proposing to you now is that really the best spot for your pile? So you have to look at that. So, and if you're brand new, these are the questions you need to be thinking about. So where should you build your pile? And if you currently have one, evaluate, is this really the best spot I should have it? So for some, you want to have it close enough that you're going to use it, but not so close that it's right there in your normal activity space. So for example, on a deck, if you're entertaining, I would not put a cold system, meaning a passive pile where you're just going to throw a bunch of stuff on there, like say lawn clippings. I would not put that right next to my deck because one, the stink alone from a compost pile that's in a cold system is going to stink out your guests or you know, enjoying your deck. Is it going to be behind a fence, or is it the back of the property, or behind the garage, or inside your home? Worm bins now have come a long way, and I've actually seen worm bin coffee tables here in Olympia. So you lift up the lid of the coffee table, and sure enough, there was a worm bin happily breaking down food scraps right in the middle of the living room. So just keep in mind that whenever if you're out there and deciding where it's best to be, you don't want to have it so far that even in, let's say, the winter time, when it's snowing or blustery rain, that you're like, I don't want to use it because it's too far to get to. So you kind of have to have that medium spot of where to put it. The other thing about it is if you have a bin is making sure that that connection with the soil is critical to making sure that those bacteria and fungus have the ability to move in and out of your pile freely. All right, so this is the recipe. This is what we've been working towards. So this is by volume. So if you have 1 bucket of green material, then you're going to add 2 buckets of brown materials plus air and water equals compost. This is it. This is what it boils down to. Now, if you have this ratio right, then you can have finished compost in an active system within 4 to 6 months. Otherwise, if you have this ratio there and you do no turning, no oxygen, you know, making sure it's oxygenated, it's not, you know, it's maybe sometimes dry or it might be wetter sometimes, then it's going to be, that process is going to draw it out more. So that could be, again, up to 2 years. So, but this is it. 1 green, 2 browns, air and water equals compost. All right, here's the green and browns. Here's the list. So if you're thinking about what a green item is, they're typically more moist, they're dense, they're things that are kind of, more movable, and they tend to be even a little bit more smelly. And it's not saying smell's a bad thing, I'm just saying they have a scent to them traditionally. So those are like grass clippings, fruits and vegetable scraps, tea bags, weeds without seeds, fresh coffee grounds, and then there's old coffee grounds on the carbon side. So if you're asking yourself what's up with that, sure enough, caffeine is found in coffee grounds, and caffeine does have an effect on the composting process. So traditionally, if you're adding coffee grounds and as you're green, and it's within 48 hours of them being brewed, they act as a green, meaning they add a boost of nitrogen or energy to that pile. Coffee grounds that have sat for weeks at a time or days at a time after those 48 hours, they're considered old coffee grounds, and they act as a bulking agent and are considered more of a carbon than they are in the nitrogen phase. So keep that in mind with your coffee grounds, that right now you can go to any of the local coffee houses, and a lot of them have bags by the door that those are the coffee grounds from this day's brew. So if you use those as your pile within, again, a day or two, they act as a green. But if they've been there and you take them home and you forget about them for a week or two, then they act as a brown, as a carbon. Okay. Manures, as we said before, you want to, they act more as is a nitrogen. So if you have a stalled pile, you want to add nitrogen to your pile. You need to add some sources of nitrogen. So anything off this list here will help start your pile again. Also water it. That's another one too. And then if your pile is very stinky or it's very slimy and messy and it's got typically the odor of a nasty pile, that means you're lacking carbon and you need some more bulking agents to balance that ratio out. So this is, when you're looking at it, you're trying to pick some of the things that act as more as a carbon here. My last little bit here, remember about the nitrogen, is that eggshells, some are okay. The one thing I would concern you right now about using eggshells in your piles is that currently through about first part of June, and it's been happening since February, is slugs and snails. This is their breeding season. And so with the breeding season, especially with snails, they need calcium sources to build their shells. So if you're putting a ton of eggshells into your pile, guess what? You've now just provided a feast for those snails to come to your pile. And so in order for them to build their new shells. So again, if you have eggshells, break them up into smaller pieces and then add them sparingly through your pile. But if you have a massive amount of chickens on your yard, I would not be putting them all in at once. Otherwise, you're going to be attracting a whole bunch of snails to your pile. And the same thing with citrus, as we told earlier, is that it's a natural antibacterial killer, so you want to monitor how much citrus you're putting into your pile. So your carbons, here is it. Sawdust, I would watch how much sawdust you put in. It can solidify and clump up if your pile goes dry, and then it's like, it acts like a cement block in your pile. As you all know, when sawdust dries, it's like solid. It can cause different problems. So keep that in mind, that you want to keep sawdust moist. Dried leaves, straw, cardboard, old coffee grounds, and small chips and twigs. Twigs and chips. So yeah. Just remember, it has nothing to do with color. It's just about nitrogens and carbons. They're called greens and browns. So the other part about building a pile, breaking, bruising, and bashing. And this is a good way to get your frustration out. Go out there with your clippers and break those bigger items down into small, manageable pieces. And we're talking, a couple feet maximum in length. So if you've got a big, huge stick there, cut it up into like 2 or 3 feet sections so that way it fits nicely into your pile. But yeah, get out those, break them up into, smaller pieces, and your pile will actually stay at a better temperature rate so that it will process those things quicker. So very large, for example, right now we were cleaning out a lot of sword ferns. So we're getting out a lot of the dead ones from there. So we have these big, massive piles of all these ferns. If I was just to put them all into a pile right now, it would act like a mat, and it would prevent the bacteria from going any further into the pile. So we took those ferns, we broke them and clipped them up into smaller pieces, and then mixed them in with other types of browns and greens. So you never just want to have 1 or 2. You try to get a mixture of the browns and greens, which will help with your pile. Ultimately, you're working for the wow factor by making sure that you have enough oxygen and water in your pile, which will produce the warmth or the heat. So turning your pile, watering it, will actually increase those bacteria, which will then produce that energy, which provides the warmth to your pile. So, and in the cold temperatures, you can actually see, I'm sure some of you have seen it, where in the cold temperatures in the wintertime, if you have a new pile being built, you'll see steam coming off of the pile. And that's what you want. You want that steam to happen, because that, again, is the warmth of that pile, and that means that the bacteria and fungus are working it. All right, recipe for success is water, water, water. And you need to have it about the consistency of a wrung out sponge. So it can't be dripping. So if you water it and it's just totally flowing right through and washing away, then your balance is inside your pile is not correct. So when you put it through the water, it should take a while for it to percolate through. But if it's just like, going straight through and actually running off, then you're missing something. You've got missing either some bulking agent, and you've got too many greens, or vice versa. You got too much bulking and you don't have enough to cape it, and so there's no bacteria actually keeping that pile intact. Okay, the other part about this is for those that have a bin, this tool is actually quite cool. it actually have a little lever here. And if you can see, when you push the tool into the pile, and this is good if you have those 3x3 plastic bins, because it's hard to get to the edges. But with this tool, it actually helps work it. And so this tool, the blades go in, but then once you're in there, they flop down, and then you use like a twisting motion. So you're lifting it and pulling it up and down, but also twisting at the same time, and it actually helps aerate a lot of those clumps, and actually making sure that you get air into your pile. They're called a compost turner. Again, you can find them online or any of our local stores there. A pitchfork is helpful, or a manure fork is helpful too. Both of them are the same. Sticks and PVC pipes. So the other part about it is that, I think I have a picture. Yeah, I do. Okay. So here's an outdoor pile. What they did is they took a PVC pipe and they drilled holes in it. And what happens is this pile here, this is way larger than a 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 foot size. But this is at a school, so they have a more industrial sized method. But the same thing could happen. You could use the same kind of process for a cold static pile too. So but what happens is these holes act as a tube that allow oxygen to go into the center of the pile. So you could just do the same thing with sticks. So if you're building a big, if you're doing a cold system, you're just going to leave it go. Make sure when you're putting a cold system together that you have some sticks or some PVC pipes with holes in it that allow oxygen to get into the center of the pile, which will allow oxygen to flow freely, which will help the center of the pile not become a dead zone. Okay. Here is Silver Springs. Again, this is the commercial facility where our curbside collection goes. And you'll see that they have these huge windrows of compost. And these, this is an old system. They actually have upgraded it now where actually in the floor of the system are holes that pipe up oxygen. But prior to them redoing their floor, they had it this way, which were the inflatable tubes. And so they basically were like, they were collapsed. They would put the compost on top of it. So these are your, your clippings that were all shredded. And then they would inflate, they would add oxygen to the tube and it would puff up inside the pile. And then as that pile was cooking and they aerated it, then that's the constant flow of oxygen helped make sure that the center of the pile was actually working. Now they've gotten rid of these kind of tubes and now they have a system in the floor where there's holes up, and as soon as they put the compost pile on it, then the oxygen comes up through the floor. The same thing, you could see the same thing for this PVC pipe, but sticks can do the same. So it's helpful to make sure that oxygen is in your pile. So in the end, the other question was, when do I know it's finished? Like when do I stop putting stuff into the pile? Eventually, you're going to have to stop putting stuff into your pile if you want finished compost, which means that you're going to have to eventually decide, you know what? Okay, I've put this in. So traditionally, like what we do is we've just built, in fact, over the last month, we built 11 new piles at one of our demonstration gardens. And we filled the bins up to the top. And already we know over the last couple of weeks, they've been shrinking in size. So we're adding a little bit more to top them off right now. But eventually coming up here, I would say by the end of the month, we're not going to be putting anything new in them. We're just going to work on getting that pile turned and watered. And that's it. And then I would say, since we built them now, April and May here, I would say by August and September, we should pretty much be ready to go with some sort of finished compost. And then it just has to sit in the curing phase. But at some point we have to decide, you know what, we're not going to add any more to that pile. And if you have all this extra stuff, you have to decide, are you going to build a new pile? Or does that end up going to a curbside collection if you don't have the space to manage it? So when you stop adding things to your pile, so adding stuff to your pile, that's considered the birthday of your pile. And then you just need to let it rest, and then you're going to turn it and water it, and that's it. And when you do that, you'll see that if you just turn and water, the frequency of which you turn your pile. Now, some people are like, you know what, I don't got time for this. So guess what's going to happen? Your pile will take longer to decompose. If you are out there every 3 days and turning that pile, that 3 foot by 3 foot pile, you'll see here in the chart here, look, the temperature, the days of decomposition and the temperature. You're going to start, and if you turn it every 3 days, look how it spikes from like maybe 90 degrees, all the way up to 160 degrees. And then it's eventually going to plateau there for a while. And then it's going to start, the heat will no longer happen. And that, as it happens, you'll end up not being able to recognize the original material in that pile. So if you had a bunch of leaves and sticks in there, by the time it's starting to come down the side of the graph here, you shouldn't be able to tell that there's a lot of leaves or a lot of sticks. You might find some bigger pieces here or there, but you'll all of a sudden start to see that it's actually turning into that finished compost. Now, if I took the same pile and I only turned it every 10 days, look, you have a little temperature spike, then it stops for a while. And that's maybe a stall. So that means, oh, I might have to add some more nitrogen to it to get it back active again. And then I go up a little bit more, and then realize it kind of peters out for a while, and eventually it'll stay there, and eventually then it'll end up coming down to a finished product. Where here, again, if I did it every 30 days, again, the spikes aren't as high, and then it just kind of peters out eventually, and it takes way longer off this chart, plus 40 days, in order to get the finished product. The problem with this is that if you aren't out there turning it all the time, is that then your temperatures don't get as hot, so that means your weed seeds can stay longer, and they may not be killed because you didn't get up that temperature that high. So that's something to keep in mind, that the average pile there, when you first initially make it, you're gonna, if it's full going, you're gonna have about 120 to 160 degrees for about 3 to 6 weeks after that initial mixing. The other question we get a lot of in our question answer clinic is, all of a sudden my pile shrunk. What's wrong with it? If your pile, when you build it, shrinks in half during this initial hot phase, you're doing it correctly. It should shrink in half during that initial phase. So there's nothing wrong. But a lot of times folks think that, oh, my pile shrunk is so much. Can I add more stuff to it? If you could add more new items on top of that, space, but you've now extended the length of when you're going to have finished compost, because every time you add in it, you're creating a new date. So eventually you're still always going to have stuff that's not finished. So how do you know if it's compost? So here, it's ready to use when it's at least 8 weeks since your initial mixing. When you turn the pile, it no longer heats up. So when you feel it, it's not hot. You can't see steam coming off of it. It looks dark, crumbly, and sweet smelling. So it looks like this, okay? On average, the whole process from building the pile to turning it to finished compost where you're able to use it on your plants should be about 4 to 6 months if you're actively using it and turning it and watering it. If you're not, then that process just gets drawn out more. And there's nothing wrong with it. It just takes longer. So the curing phase, this is the one phase that most people forget. And if you're putting compost on your fruits and vegetables, this is a step that is really critical to the success of your fruits and vegetables. If you put finished compost, which it looks like this, again, sweet smelling, dark, crumbly, it looks great, but you didn't let it rest, and you put that on fresh starts, meaning seedlings that have just started, the hot compost could actually burn the plants. So you want to make sure that if you're putting it on vegetable beds, that you give the time for, even though it looks finished, you want to give it some time to just sit and rest. And then at that point, it could be up to 2 months, depending on how big of a pile that you have, before you actually apply that to your vegetable beds. And during this curing phase, if you were to take the temperature, it'd be between 80 and 110 degrees. That's a normal curing temperature for a pile that's curing. So, yeah, I don't get into a lot of the whole recipes within the nitrogen and carbon ratios. There's a whole nother science about that that's not designed for this course, or for this class, but we can talk about that at a different time. That does have some effect on this overall curing phase as well. So then once you have it, then you're like, what do I do with it? Because guaranteed you're still going to have some bigger chunks that may not have completely been completely finished out. So you might have some sticks or some bigger chunks of material that just hasn't had enough time to do that. So we suggest that you use a screen. This one we just built out of wood here, and we put some hardware cloth on the bottom of it. We put this over our wheelbarrow, and then we put the compost in it, and we just sift it. And then all the finished compost comes to the bottom, and anything that's left behind, we use then to put back into the new pile. And then it goes through another cycle. And eventually, over time, those bigger pieces will eventually break down. So a screen can be easily made. There's plenty of plans online. We also have some on our website that also help you to make to determine what's the best way to make the frame. And then we suggest doing it over a wheelbarrow, because then you can wheel this over to the bed when you're finished. So this pile you took that was curing, now it's actually ready to be used. We sift it right onto the wheelbarrow, and then we roll it over to the bed, and we can apply it right there to your ornamentals. So how do you use compost? There is a new fact sheet, well, 2 fact sheets that I'm going to share with you that has some follow-up information, but here are some examples. The one tidbit I will say is that if you're putting compost, let's say you're putting it into a new plant, and you want to dig this in. So you dig a hole. You want to make sure that you don't just put the compost in the hole that you dug, but actually in the entire bed. The reason why, again, those roots are brand new. If you didn't properly cure the compost, you could burn the roots. Also, also that new plant is happy in that little composting area. And so because all the nutrients are there, and it needs to branch out into the rest of the native soil, and it doesn't want to because it wants to stay where all those nutrients are. So if you put the compost in the entire bed, then you've got that plant being able to move out farther. So that way it just doesn't stay in, and the root ends up getting balled up on each other, which cause bigger issues as well. Applying it on lawns, you can apply it to your shrubs and berries, and then sprinkle it in your flower beds. And there's a whole chart on this about how to actually use your finished compost in each of these applications, and what the frequency is as well. Mixing it with your veggies, adding it to your potting soil, and if you're wanting to kill like an area of your lawn, sheet mulching is another method that works. It's layering of cardboard and compost, and eventually it kills off the lawn in that area, where then you can make a new bed for planting. So Oregon State University just put out a new publication this year. It started last year, and they actually finished it this year. It's called How to Use Compost in Gardens and Landscapes. Again, these are all free resources. They are scientifically proven to work, and so they're great resources for that, and it'll be in your resource email. This is what finished compost should look like. See, it kind of looks like coffee grounds, but it's not. It's actually compost, and it's filled with nutrients that are your house plants and your yard plants, but also your lawns will all benefit from the nutrients from that. But my only warning is, if I add a little bit, so I'll just double or triple the amount I put in there so that my plants will be extra vigorous. Should you do that? The answer is no. So you want to follow the recommendations for whatever you put is recommended for that particular bed or lawn based on what the material is. But doubling or tripling the amount of putting on for that particular space will not benefit the plant. In fact, there's more adverse effects by over-composting than under-composting. So you end up with too much phosphorus, which ends up running off and causing algal blooms in your local lakes. It deters your turf, because what happens is that compost holds moisture and actually affects the amount of moisture held in the lawn right there, which could cause disease, but also the usability of the lawn. You'll end up having like pockets of mush in your lawns by over applying compost. Same thing with it. The actual plant can only take up so many nutrients, and by providing too much of it, it actually can cause an adverse effect to the plant where they're not able to take it all up and actually overload on nutrients, which causes problems. And here, not on the west side, but on the east side of the state, we end up having more problems with salt accumulation in more drier areas when you have too much compost there. And if you're buying it, you're wasting money, because that's another thing. If you're buying compost and putting it in your beds, but you're over applying it, then that money's just going to waste. So overusing compost is not great. Other troubleshooting, this is in one of the handouts too from WSU on home composting, which I'll show you here in a second. But this here are your symptoms of problems. So there's a great chart. If it's too wet and it smells like rancid butter or vinegar, then you've got not enough air. And so your solution is to add it, turn it, and add carbons. Add your browns. Let's say your pile's dead in the center. It's dry, doesn't material, so you need to water it and add some more greens. If the heap is dampened in the middle but nowhere else on the side, so let's say you have that cold passive system where you just have a mound, typically the center of the pile will always stay active, but then the peripheral sides will end up dying out. That's where you want to try to get some more oxygen in, or mix it into the center, or the pile may be too small. So you want to make sure that you add more greens to that and making sure that your side, peripheral side, has just as much as the center does. And then the heap is damp and sweet smelling but doesn't heat up. That means you're lacking nitrogen, so you need to add some more greens to that as well. These are a couple of the basic problems with composting piles. There's more, and we have options for you with that too. Right now, composting critters are, some of these are applicable now, some not. Right now, slugs and snails are your biggest threat. So you want to go in there, if you lift up, let's say you have a plastic bin, you lift up and you see a bunch of slugs and snails, get them out. Because, right, as I said, they're mating season right now. Those eggs will be laid in your compost pile, which then you'll take that finished compost and spread them out to your beds, which now you've spread their eggs all over your yard. So the best thing to do is if you see clusters of, they look like about, I don't know, 25 to 50 little globules that kind of look like tapioca pearls. Those are slugs or snail eggs. You want to remove those, drown them in some soapy water, and get rid of them. But don't leave them in your piles. Right now, in our piles, when we were building them, we saw salamanders, we saw newts, we saw snakes, we had mice. Those were all overwintering in our pile because we hadn't managed it. We just, because of COVID, we haven't been able to get in. So all our pile has really grown. And so in there, we had a whole bunch of critters that end up taking residence in there. If you're actively turning, you're going to have less of these items. The thing that is not flies in the summertime and ants are traditionally the problem in the heat. So flies, if you have a lot of, let's say you open your bin and you've got a plume of flies that pop up, put some wet cardboard on the top, and then the flies cannot lay their eggs on slick surfaces, and so you'll have less flies. So just wet cardboard on the top of your piles will help keep the moisture in, but also prevent flies from overtaking your pile. Ants, if you have ants in your pile, that means your pile's too dry. So you need to water it. Water the compost and the ants will go away. Spiders are actually good. So if you have spiders in your pile, leave them. They're actually doing a great benefit. And I'll tell you more about that if you attend our other composting critters section where we go into the microscopic organisms of there. I'll share all the kind of fun things about are happening at a microscopic level there. So this was our pile that we had. This is one of them at our Dirtworks demonstration garden in Yager Park across from the Capitol Mall. Again, this pile sat for a full year now because, again, we couldn't get into it. And so we started managing it now. But basically in here there was, again, mice. We had snakes in there. We had a little bit of everything. We got ants in there now because it was dry. So we got rid of them this last week. But we used this dry material, which now end up being a brown and a bulking agent. And we end up creating and filling all these new bins. So we filled 11 of them so far. But we have all different styles of bins for folks to see the different types. We have wire mesh and we have the earth machines. These are the BioStacks. We have all different types. But ultimately, we want to have this, right now, you can see this old picture. This is one where we actually had an empty bin. But if we went back, this is actually it. So behind this are actually concrete blocks. So we're using this now as a brown, and we're mixing that with the new cuttings in our garden that they're taking out. So they're dividing plants, they're deadheading things, and when they're doing that, we're using the mixture of these browns with the new stuff to make these bins. So here. So what you should be doing right now is stockpiling your carbon sources, because in the summertime, you tend to have more green materials, which are like your fresh clippings, and then you don't have anything for carbon sources. But then in the fall and winter, where you have leaves, all your stuff that you're piling up from your yard cleanup, you have an excess of browns then. So you always want to try to manage that. You always have stockpiles of something, either lots of greens or lots of browns. But more importantly, I stockpile carbons or browns more than I do anything else, because sometimes they'll be they'll be hard to come by at certain times of the year. The last bit that is the bit I want to share about right now, just because a lot of people are doing this right now, it isn't necessarily a composting process, but I want to say about mulch. With arborist wood chips, they're great. In fact, there's a whole fact sheet about the benefits of arborist wood chips. But right now I'm seeing a lot of this happen, which is incorrect, is that they're mounding it up over the trees here. Please do not do this. These are called, volcano mulching, or mulch volcanoes. And this is actually detrimental to your trees. You want to have a space around the bark. You should see the flare of the actual tree. And if you can put mulch down, but just make sure that there's a space around the tree where you've got some actual bare soil between the mulch and the base of the tree, where you can actually see the tree flare, how the tree comes down to the soil. You shouldn't, this looks like it was just plopped into a big pile of mulch, which it was. And in fact, the disease that has a potential for this is devastating for this tree. So don't mulch right now with that. Use the mulch that's better, and then that's one way, is just making sure that it's never incorporated into the soil, or mounded up in these big piles. So, all right. So I think our last. Oh yes. So now we're at the resources. So this is it. So here's our website, and you will get a follow-up email with this link. Or you can just Google us, the WC Extension Master Recycler Composter Program, and you'll come to our webpage, and we have all of these different resources that are free and available to anybody. Feel free to share them with anybody. All the composting publications, the pro and con of the bin styles, our future workshops, all of that. Right now, our demonstration gardens we're not having we have some parties, but we don't have any active workshops happening. Dirtworks is not open to the public currently right now. Farmers Market, you can walk through it, but there's not a lot of volunteers activity happening. Same thing with our third garden, which is closed loop out at the Waste and Recovery Center. Very minimal work parties right now. So we're not holding workshops where normally, pre-COVID, we would have in-person composting workshops on a monthly basis. So I hope that once this is over, we'll be able to get back to that schedule, and you'll be able to participate if you choose to actually be on site, and we can walk you through hands-on how the composting process works and help you problem solve any problems. The other thing about it too, we also have a Master Recycler Composter volunteer training. So if you're really passionate about composting and you want to be part of our volunteer program, we have a training coming up this fall starting in September. And you can learn more about that. We'll be posting details on July about the application process for that. This, again, is a great publication. Here's a great website, gardening.wcu.edu. Free fact sheets, hundreds of fact sheets on every type of gardening practice topic that you could want, but there's a whole section on composting. Again, peer-reviewed, scientifically proven resources and geared for Washington residents. So that's the best part. When you Google stuff, you get stuff from all over the country and the world. It may not be applicable here. The resources that we're providing tonight are proven to do well here for Washington. We also have a question answer clinic. So if you have a composting question or a gardening question or a recycling question, you can email us, and our Master Gardener and Master Recycler Composter volunteers will answer you back. So here's the email for it. You can just email us at master here at co.thurston.wa.us, and then our volunteers will email you back answers to your questions. And again, I've already talked about our 3 demonstration gardens. As soon as COVID gets over, we'll have more frequency and activity at these gardens for you to come participate. Since we're not having in-person workshops at our gardens, we are having more virtual activities, and so we have 4 lunch and learns coming up. So coming up here, starting in June, we have in July, August, and September from noon to 1, either on a Tuesday or a Thursday. Bring your lunch, log on to Zoom, and we'll be sharing some of these information and tidbits and tips throughout the growing season here. So our next one is on June 1st, and we're going to be talking about reliable gardening resources that are applicable to Washington problems in your garden and your compost. The July one, we hope to actually be a live YouTube feed where we would go to the garden and you would log into YouTube and watch us actually build a pile, and we could have some engagement that way. Then we're going to do some tips on the best tips for harvesting your vegetables in August, and then fall cleanup, yard clips, cleanup tips, which also include composting. So those are coming up. That list is also on our website as well. So that's it. Hopefully, if there's any other questions, please put them in the Q&A box. I thank you for participating in today's webinar, and I hope that to see you at one of the upcoming Lunch and Learns. Do be watchful of the reminder email that we'll send out. It will include all the resource links and as well as an evaluation. So happy composting. In the meantime, Jenny, if there's any other questions, I'll be happy to take them. You're muted, I think.
Oh, I am.
Okay.
One last question for you, Corey. Does the compost bin need to be in full sun?
No. You can compost in the shade or the sun, doesn't matter. The sun, the only thing with sun that it dries out faster. Shaded compost piles tend to keep their moisture longer, obviously, because the sun isn't beating down on it. But yes, compost can happen in there. If you do it in the shade, it may take, you just have to monitor the moisture content for full sun.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for coming out tonight and learning about home composting. And yeah, look for that follow-up email probably early next week. So have a great night.
Bye-bye. Happy composting.